Welcome to the Community Development Podcast, a podcast dedicated to community development practice and approaches, sharing our learning and connecting the workforce. My name is Russell. Welcome to episode 49. My name is Russell in a very damp Cardiff in Wales. We're going to be visiting Ireland today for an episode, and I will introduce our guests in a moment. A little call back to the last episode, episode 47. We were talking about human rights and how we make rights real. We were joined by Hannah Kitchen-Kirby and Claire McIlvary. And Hannah was talking about some of the work that she's been involved in Leith, in Edinburgh, Cable's Wine House, better known as the Banana Flats. If you've seen Train Spotting, you'll have seen these flats. A really fascinating talk about how you make people more aware of their rights, and once they're aware of those rights, what they can do with that awareness to really kind of tackle some of the issues that oppress them. And in that case, it was about housing. And we also spent some time with Claire up in Double Dykes near Perth, about her work with gypsy travellers there, again within a sort of a housing context about rights. So please go and check that out. That was episode 47. So we're in Ireland. We were last in Ireland, episode 40, and we had Donald Traynor from Community Finance Ireland, and we had Conor McGale from the Rose Regeneration Trust based in Omagh, and we were looking at social value and the social value of community finance. And it is thanks to Donald, that was episode 40 by the way, and it's thanks to Donald that we have one of our guests here this morning. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome to the podcast Caitriona Mullan, who's in Derry. I think it's also possibly a bit rainy and damp there as well. Welcome to the podcast.
Cheers, thank you.
And a little bit down the road from me in Cardiff, we've got Dr Giada Lagana. Buongiorno.
Good morning, buongiorno.
Caitriona, can I ask you just to introduce yourself and tell us a little bit more about where you're based and what you do?
Thanks, Russell. And it's really nice to be invited to participate in the discussion. Always delighted to have time to reflect and chat over the kind of things that some of us grapple with every day in a professional context as well as a life context. So what can I tell you about myself? These days I'm freelance. I'm a cross-border cooperation and policy specialist with a sideline in collaborative governance and sort of institutional reform. So how I ended up here, these days I'm based in Derry in Northern Ireland, about a mile from the border, and I work into Europe a lot. So I'm a senior external expert with the European Commission, working on structural funds issues and on cross-border territorial cooperation issues. I also work with the Association of European Border Regions, which is Europe's oldest NGO dedicated to promoting cross-border cooperation. And I have a few other, portfolio projects, and I'm also an independent researcher. I'm a Derry woman. I moved back here after the peace agreement, and I'm raising teenagers in Northern Ireland. So I think that should give you an idea of the different perspectives that I may bring to the conversation, depending on what we're talking about.
If my daughter was part of this, and you mentioned teenagers in Derry, she'd want to talk all about Derry girls. And she's desperate for my wife and I to take her over there. That's for another episode, perhaps.
Indeed. Well, do that, and do a podcast from Derry. Really interesting stuff there. Yeah,
that would be grand. And we've, the podcast has visited the whole island a couple of times. A very early episode was with Johnny Curry, working in East Belfast, and talking about some of the stuff that he's involved in there. I mean, I think that's way back, something like episode 17 or 18. It's yonks ago, but an episode I always say this. I learn a lot just from speaking to people, and I like speaking to people. I was at an event in Swansea in South Wales yesterday and met a lot of people for the first time, and I was talking about some of the stuff I'm involved in, and it's just great to hear the different contexts in which people are working, and you always walk away, or I always walk away just having learned something new, or at the very least it just kind of is reminding you of something that you might have forgotten, or you might have maybe has got a bit buried away under everything else that goes on in life and work and things. So yeah. Giada, would you like to say a little bit more about yourself and how, and also I suppose how an Italian based in Wales comes to have an interest in Ireland?
Yeah, absolutely. This is a very common question that I get. Well, I would start by saying that I'm a Liverpool early career research fellow and a lecturer in politics in the School of Law and Politics at Cardiff University. I joined Cardiff University in 2019 as I would say an expert on cross border cooperation, not only north south on the island of Ireland, but I've also worked extensively on Ireland Wales relations and cross border cooperation across the Irish Sea. My first book is entitled The European Union and the Northern Ireland Peace Process, and it's based on my PhD and explores really the EU approach to conflict resolution and peace building in Northern Ireland, but very much from a cross-border perspective. And I'm currently writing my second single-authored monograph, which should appear hopefully next year, published by Oxford University Press, and speaks about the role of civil servants and the public bureaucracy in sustaining the environment conducive to positive cross-border cooperation, not just again north-south on the island of Ireland, but east-west as well. And how I got interested into all of this, well, I would say, first and foremost, I'm a border person. I grew up 3 kilometers from the French border in Italy. And we always say that when we grew up as border people, we actually bring our border with us. But this is mostly to say that I was exposed since very early days of how cooperation across border can help reducing differences in living standards, addressing common challenges, and how, especially from a point of view, I would say, of tourism and environment, the border can actually become a resource and not just a barrier. And with my years into uni, then I realized that not all borders are implementing cooperation across borders is not always a peaceful affair. There are a lot of borders that are very contested, and after a trip to Ireland, I fall in love with Ireland, and I just decided that I would basically dedicate my life to the study of Irish history and politics.
Wow, one of my favourite novels is called Border Country. It's by Raymond Williams. And Raymond Williams was born in a little village, rural village called Pandy, which is probably about a mile and a half to the west of the border between Wales and England, and is very much about this concept of borderness. And I've always had a fascination. Geography was my kind of my academic university kind of subject and discipline. I've always been fascinated by place. My father was a sales rep, and he would travel a lot around kind of South Wales, up the M4 into England. Interestingly, in the early 80s, he was the only rep in the company that was prepared to go to Belfast to do some, repping up and down the high streets in both East and West Belfast. He felt he had no skin in the game, as it were, at that time with the Troubles. And actually, that concept of psychogeography has always fascinated me, and the stories of the businesses that he would encounter, and some of them were Italian, some of them were run by Iranians, and some of them were just by Welsh people, or whoever it was. That kind of life's rich tapestry. Place was part of his stories, his tales about where he went that day and who he got an order off and things like that. And I think I was always fascinated by that sort of stuff. And I don't know whether it's a farming grandfather and the connection with land and what, I don't know, but it's deep within me. So I'm really keen to speak with you both, because I'm also a little bit interested in borders, the rough and the smooth that they bring. Notwithstanding Giada's academic sort of interest and expertise and having a concept of sort of borderness herself, it's your lived reality, Caitriona, isn't it? And I'm interested in what you said at the start there about you returned to Derry after the sort of the peace agreement. I'm very much an outsider to this discussion and debate in a material sense, but we hear a lot about the border, and there's probably a legion of podcasts out there that really go into Northern Ireland and things like that, and people probably to go to those rather than listen to this. But it is that lived reality, presumably, to you, unless of course it isn't, and because it's about it not becoming this thing that defines stuff that goes on in Derry and on the other side of the border, for that matter, Caitriona. Tell us a little bit more about that lived experience of it, and maybe just a little bit more about that you returned after the peace agreement.
Sure, it's funny, Russell, you mentioned reading a novel about borderlands, and that's actually what sort of turned you on to the idea. The thing I forgot to say is actually I'm also a fledgling novelist. I won the Irish Writers' Centre Novel Fair in 2024 with my first novel, and I am anticipating that it's going to come out next year or early 27. So, and it's called Slackwater, and it's all about liminality, and it's all about borderlands and transitions and things like that. So,
wow,
you've really spoken to a note that's in my head. Anyway, I wrote that over about 10 years after I'd moved back when my children were very small, when I was sort of sitting up at night, usually with a baby. I think your point about place and that sort of psychogeography is really well made. I think, and Giada will know this because she comes from a border region too, is that there is a particular quality to lived experience if you have lived in a border region or if you're from a region, because there is this constant fluid interplay between a sense of place and space that is not bounded, it's not bordered, and the sort of the constant unbordering, debordering, rebordering that goes on depending on what plane of daily life you're talking about. And I think that's true of a lot of places, particularly where you have had contested borderlands. You've had borders that have, there are parts of Central and Eastern Europe that, you can live an entire lifespan and have, the border has moved around you 2-3 times. So, since the end of the Second World War, for example. So there is something about a very unique quality of experience that is about borderlands. I mean, I grew up in Derry. For people who, I'd be surprised if people don't know where it is by now, given the massive success of Derry Girls. But Derry is a city also known as Londonderry, and it was originally a monastic settlement on the banks of Lough Foyle, which is in the northwest of Ireland. And it was originally a monastic settlement that then became it was a major plantation city, planted by the city itself, as it's built with the walled city now, was founded by the Merchant Taylors Company of London. And it was very like some of those trading posts in Virginia that were built by the British. So Derry has these layers of settlement history. It's also a port city, and has all of that sort of sense of looking outward and looking out to the rest of the world. So the idea of borders it's an interesting one, and it depends where you are in the Irish border as well. I think Derry retained its hinterland connections with Donegal very, very strongly, because essentially Derry was the capital city, the main city for the northwest of the island. It was also one of the main emigration ports for the North Atlantic in the 19th century. So Derry's economy grew massively in the 1840s, which was the period of the famine, with massive emigration. So after the War of Independence, Derry was cut off physically on 3 sides from its hinterland by the border, the Irish border as it is now. So in that sense, people don't just suddenly amputate their relationship with the hinterland, and I think that's true of practically any border I know in Europe, and Giada will know this too. I mean, I travel to borders all over Europe, north, south, east, west, regularly, and you do have this common sense of being bordered but not being bordered at the same time. I mean, the Irish border also, I suppose it's fair to say, was the most militarized border in Western Europe, east of the Iron Curtain, when I was growing up. But it's also important to say that it was not a closed border in the sense of the Iron Curtain. It was actually a border where people were free to pass backwards and forwards. There was a customs border as well. And when the European single market was introduced, the customs posts disappeared. And that was psychologically a hugely important thing, because that was another type of freedom of movement. So when you look into the Irish border, it was always porous. The military checkpoints were there largely for intelligence gathering purposes and for population surveillance purposes, to understand who was crossing the border and when and why. But people were free to move. So that's an important piece. So I grew up in Derry. My mother was from Dublin. I have one grandparent from Ulster. So my life was really spent going backwards and forwards, up and down the country, across the border in the summer holidays, spending time in the Irish Midlands, spending time in the west of Ireland with grandparents. My grandparents travelled to Derry from the south, which was quite an unusual thing during the Troubles for a lot of Southerners to do, was to actually come north. So we had a very liminal, fluid relationship with the two jurisdictions. And I went to study in Trinity College, studied history in the 90s there. And I do remember also still feeling like it was moving between two worlds. You know, when you got on a bus in Dublin and you went to Derry, this was still during the Troubles. And I went to college in 1991, and I was lucky. I was able to stay on the island of Ireland, and I believe that kept me on the island of Ireland largely for my professional life. But I think your point about place is very important, because I also think one of the most successful concepts for building intercultural cooperation and competency in border areas, or areas that have been bordered or divided by borders, is shared sense of place and the connection with place. And I think that's something that we understand in these islands, perhaps because we have had less need to separate from place. We haven't had mass displacement like our brothers and sisters on the European continent have experienced and are currently experiencing in relation to the war in Ukraine. We had a relatively settled population on the two islands. So we understand that connection with place. We understand that connection with what in Gaelic culture was known as tua, which means land, but it also means people, and it means a place that people are of. So I could just go on and on, but I'll stop there, Russell, because you probably want to ask another question.
No, it's fascinating, and I think, if we're talking about a specific context as well, then it's important to have a little bit of that flavour and a little bit of that history, and as much a wider kind of acknowledged, generally accepted history as well as your own. And I'm trying to think, what are we, 2025? So in 2023, I caught a bus it was a lovely journey from Belfast to Sligo, which crosses the border, and we changed in Enniskillen.
Yeah.
And we had about an hour and a half to kill, which is almost dangerously too long. It's the sort of, so we went to have a drink. We sort of felt, actually, if it was like half an hour, we'd have to be in and out. But an hour and a half is the sort of time that it's almost worryingly long. You can lose yourself in a little town, perhaps like Enniskillen, and I'm sure others. And I think we crossed. I think the little sort of stone bridge that we traversed to cross the border was actually really quite uneventful. And I don't know whether I had something maybe a little bit more grandiose in my mind, given how much it had been in the news because of things like customs and I'm sorry to raise the B word, but Brexit and so on. But almost a border that's there, but also isn't there at the same time, which I think is fascinating. So Giada, to what extent does some of this resonate with you, both as an individual, growing up close to a border of your own, but also resonates with some of the stuff that you studied? Because presumably a lot of your work is involved in talking to people and hearing about their experiences.
Yes, absolutely. I can totally, by the way, empathize with the fact of crossing the border from the Republic of Ireland into Northern Ireland being quite uneventful. I remember the first time I was actually going to Belfast as a master student, researching already on the topic. And I was expecting, sincerely, I don't know what. And the only sign that told me that I was finally getting into Northern Ireland was a message on my phone saying that the line had changed. But over the years, what has really been at the core of my discussions with, I would say different layers of the Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland society. So interviewing and also attending events and dissemination type of activities with policymakers, other academics, but also in particular grassroots leaders and civil society organizations. I would say that I could divide this into three main themes. The first one is to what extent there is this sense of common space and common place in the mindset of people on the island. So, this idea of borders in the minds, have they been positively impacted by these European Union membership principles and principles of European integration that then have somewhat broke these differences, and to what extent? Second, I certainly have discussed largely the idea focusing at the core of European Union programs, such as, for example, the Interreg program or the European Union Peace and Reconciliation program, especially trying to understand with people who have contributed to the design of policies and participate to initiatives. How wide is the implementation gap? And in terms of implementation gap, I mean, generally there are objectives set at the European Commission level, into which civil societies and policymakers from the island have tried to feed in their own priorities that might variate across times and territories. And these not always unfold at the local level as it was thought they would. And I think that one of the key issues that I have registered over the years in that is the fact that often, unfortunately, the European Union does not take into account the divisiveness of Northern Ireland, not just towards the Republic of Ireland, but also within. The fact then that Northern Ireland society is still deeply divided, that there is not just the Irish border, but there are borders within the cities, the peace wall, the so-called peace walls that still divide communities. So this idea of having people working together cannot be fostered, prompted, and also measured by metrics, but it needs to be taken into account that different type of approaches need to be taken in order to at least facilitate this type of cooperation. And I think that with all the very good and positive work that the European has undertaken, this is still something that has not been fully addressed. And third point, which is something that my recent work has focused as part of a project led by the Merchant Center at Ohio State University, which looks at comparing reconciliation in Northern Ireland, Colombia, and the Basque Country. I eventually ended up talking to people and asking them, what does reconciliation means to you? Do you think that the Good Friday Agreement has actually brought reconciliation also across the three pillar structure of the Good Friday Agreement? And the answers have been very diverse in their contents, in their meanings, even with the fact that everyone in Northern Ireland seems to define reconciliation in different ways. But what I think is really key is that there is probably now a willingness to move from that mindsets of the Good Friday Agreement, Belfast Good Friday Agreement, pardon, I always have to say the full name. So there is this need to move from this environment of compromise to an environment of alignment, where in particular different narratives and different perspective on the same points of view needs to be able to coexist. So it's what I would call a move from agreement to alignment. But this, I think, it's very much true, not just for Northern Ireland, but for the island of Ireland as a whole. And again, I have heard discussions and preliminary analysis, especially taken by the Republic of Ireland, into how to get to that move. We probably would like to see it also happening on the British side. And Northern Ireland sides as well, which has been probably a little bit lacking so far. But Catriona can say something about it if she disagrees with me.
She's quite right in some ways that I absolutely agree that you cannot measure integration and inclusion and reconciliation purely by quantitative metrics. There is a qualitative dimension to this, and there are other measures are absolutely necessary. Integration in childhood, mixed education, all of those sort of things are hugely important for stability. I would also say, and this is speaking as someone who grew up here from a Catholic family background, but went 2/3 of my early education, sort of primary and secondary, 2/3 of that was in mixed state schools where I was in an intercultural environment. I would say that while we do still have terrible hard-end divisions in society, in certain communities and certain aspects of Northern Ireland society, there is another side to Northern Ireland, which is that ability to coexist. And it's actually that ability to coexist of the vast majority in Northern Ireland, to coexist peacefully without violence. Now, it's not to say without prejudice, but without violence. And it is because of that majority of people in Northern Ireland that the place did not descend into complete out and out civil war in the 70s and the 80s. And that's a really important point to make, because I think what I have found frustrating as someone from the North, and I have worked in the public sector on both sides of the border. I've worked with and between the community sector and the public sector on a lot of these issues for a long time. I ran Interreg programs in the Central Border region in the early noughties, when the whole of the border counties in Northern Ireland were emerging from the conflict, trying to do things like repair the bridges that had been blown up to control border activity and all of those sort of things. So what I would say is that there has been a tendency to focus on the extremes and the problematics of reconciliation between very extreme positions, and that is necessary and that is fine. But I think there is a price for overly focusing on that in political terms, which, number one, ignores the vast majority of people who have kept the place stable for a very long time, but number two, gives far too much power to elements that are not prepared to move on. So I will say that. I think it's worth just making that point because one of the things I didn't explain actually how I got to be doing what I'm doing professionally, but I worked in social policy in Ireland in the 90s. And then I worked in social economic development, social economy development, again, all over the Republic, but while still based in Dublin. And then I moved up to the Northwest and I worked in regional economic and community development. And then I ran Interreg programs. I then did 10 years in the NHS, going in first to run a cross-border health program around alcohol and communities and early intervention. So I spent a lot of time dealing with the impact of conflict on societies, on communities, on families, and all of the intergenerational trauma that comes from that, and social and economic deprivation combined, and the health inequalities that brings. So I suppose what I feel frustrated about is this constant insistence, and I would say it's also an insistence of the establishment in the Republic of Ireland, to only see Northern Ireland through a lens of sectarian identity politics, and to understand that there are other things that are needed and in fact make it more difficult for those kind of sectarian identity politics to be exploited. There will always be elements within any society that will exploit people's disadvantage, exploit people's poverty, exploit people's sense of disempowerment. And in some societies, those are criminal elements. And in some societies, they may also have an element of identity and control. But the fact of the matter is that we are a hell of a lot more than the narratives about us. And that's a very important thing. I think also my sense of my Europeanness has been very much influenced by the fact that I did grow up in Derry. We have a very strong sense of the importance of the international human rights agenda. My MEP when I was growing up was John Hume. So we had a sense of that European policy agenda and how it affected us. And I think also in Northern Ireland, European membership did contribute, I think, to a kind of intersectionality that exists certainly in my kids' generation in Northern Ireland. It's really, really marked. And that's not something that is immediately recognised about Northern Ireland. And I think that's a huge asset, and it gives me a lot of hope. I think the point you made about the agreement, Giada, I just call it the agreement because actually I think there were different versions of it printed, but the first version of it was just simply the agreement 1998. So I do refer to the agreement. And I think it's like everything else, language is key to whether people are going to listen to you or not. And you really have made that point very well. The thing that I think about the agreement at this stage is that Northern Ireland still has major challenges, largely because of the way in which decision making is done in terms of the Strand 1 political dimension of the agreement. I think there's opportunity for reform of the agreement. I think an awful lot of people agree with that. So that you cannot have a sectarian veto on what's really important, sort of life and death policy making, things like health budgets and things like that. I think what we also have in Northern Ireland is now, and I've noticed this, and I remarked on this at an event that I was asked to speak at by the Northern Ireland Executive on deepening East-West cooperation in the Irish Sea space. I made the point that we have 25 years of experience of embedded equality screening of policy making and budgetary decision making in Northern Ireland. There is nowhere else in Europe, in the EU, that does that at this point in time. So we have a kind of a competency around diversity and difference that is something that we have learned over the last 25 years because the equality categories were embedded into our legislation that embedded the agreement. Now, that legislation was UK primary domestic legislation, also in the Republic of Ireland. So everyone in the UK and everyone in the Republic of Ireland is entitled to the same benefits from the agreement, not just the people of Northern Ireland. So there's a tendency to see the agreement as something that was really about, everybody in Northern Ireland just getting on with each other. This notion that we all live in this binary world where we're either green or orange just isn't true. It's not the experience of an awful lot of people. It's not the sole experience of an awful lot of people either. But the idea that, for me, the extension of the commitments that both governments made in the Good Friday Agreement to their whole populations is a really interesting area for exploration. The fact of the matter is that if I'm a first generation Nigerian Irish teenager in Limerick, do I know that I have rights that are protected under the Good Friday Agreement? Has there been that kind of level of education in schools and communities throughout Ireland and the UK? Because we have to remember that the agreement in 1998 was an international peace treaty. And as such, it was passed by plebiscite. It was endorsed by plebiscite in both Northern Ireland and in the Republic of Ireland. But it's a really important document for how we can live together. And I think it's worth a read. So going back to the role of the EU, I think Giada made the point that the EU doesn't always, shall we say the administration of funding is always a challenge, and how funding is ultimately accounted for is always a challenge. And I think there are many, many people who deal with certain types of funding all over Europe who will say, numbers are not telling the full story of the benefit of this investment. I do think it's important to say that if the European Union had not had the Interreg programme, for example, our placemaking, particularly in Northern Ireland, the border region, would be probably a lot less advanced. I think European programming has given people access to resources for peace building, which have been hugely important. I think there's always been this tension for me between the idea of focusing on difference and focusing on commonality. And my experience of running Interreg programs in the Central Border region in the early noughties was that when things are so divisive and so painful, for people. And we were talking about, within 5 years of the peace agreement that I was doing some of this work. And the thing that I felt was sometimes there is healing in bringing people to focus on things that they know they all agree on, as opposed to focusing on the differences. And that actually the practice and the lived experience of working together on something that you're both in agreement on is important for your communities, for example, for politicians, that in itself is healing. And suddenly the differences look smaller by the end of that process. So I'm a great believer in the practice of collaboration as a road to peace building. And I think there needs to be a balance of investment in that kind of work with work and single identity work and work that focuses on difference as such. I know that was a bit of a long-winded one, but I hope that gives you some sense of things.
No, I think it's really helpful. I mean, I think for all of the politicians and the programmes and the governments, whether they're in Belfast or Dublin or London or wherever, it requires people, doesn't it, to come together. It requires people in their communities, in their neighbourhoods. And Giada, you're absolutely right about, you stole my thunder a little bit. Borders aren't just confined to the nation state and between sovereign countries. They exist down high streets. They exist sort of between our towns and within our villages and cities and all the rest of it. So it requires people at that community level, doesn't it? And I think that's where community development kind of helps, because it also recognises that it can be a long-term process. Sorry, Giada, do you want to come in?
I just want to say to Caitriona that I'm so glad that I'm not anymore always the only one arguing for the positive impact of European Union membership and of the European Union role in peace building on the island of Ireland. When I started my PhD, it has been a real challenge to actually overcome with evidence this idea that the only thing the European Union has done was to throw money at Northern Ireland and to basically create an industry for peace. While I'm a firm believer that while the process was not perfect, the European Union has been an essential piece of the puzzle. And I also I'm very proud of having met John Hume when he was still here, and even if his health was poorly, it has been one of my greatest honor in life.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right, and I think, for me, yes. Look, I think there was a lot of money thrown at single identity stuff, which to an extent was about recognition of difference and recognition of traditions. But I also think that there has been a lot of shall we say, disingenuous exploitation of those kind of resources. And I think at this stage, any funder who is investing in the perpetuation of divisive single identity issues in a way that is antagonistic in a social context needs to think carefully about what the focus of that investment is. I absolutely agree. I think it's also worth saying it's not just about the European funding. I think it's really important also, when you're talking about the agreement itself and the peace process, to say that, and this is again a perspective that sometimes challenges this idea that it was political genius that obtained the agreement. If you actually go back in and look at the archives, there was an awful lot made possible by Ireland and the UK's common membership of the EU. There was a huge amount made possible by the fact that the UK, as a very, very active and innovative EU member state at the time, was really taking the Maastricht Europe of the Regions agenda very seriously and was combining that with devolution in the UK. And I do not believe that it would have been possible to have a peace agreement in Northern Ireland were the UK not going through that devolution process. It became possible for there to be a structure within the UK by which Northern Ireland could have a level of devolved government. And I think that's a huge element that is missed. So the idea of territorial reform, public administrative reform, enhanced decentralised democratic governance that the UK drove was really important. And I think it's important also to say that, again, if you look back through the correspondence between civil servants on both sides of the Irish Sea through the 1990s in relation to common approaches to be taken to things like the single market, to joint approaches to labour market planning, shared approaches to regeneration of social and economically deprived regions. There was all this correspondence going on between civil servants in England, Ireland, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland on these issues. And so I think the common European membership in general was very important. And I think what we're now in is a period where European Union was continuing to invest in Northern Ireland with financial contributions from both the UK and Ireland. But also we have this situation where the UK is reconsidering its relationship with the European Union, but we've also suddenly become an external border of the European Union. And the UK itself has this huge institutional memory and legacy, and an intellectual legacy that it gave to the European Union as well, to consider in how we recognise the benefits of that association with the European Union. So I think we're into a different era with it. But I would absolutely agree with you, Giada. I mean, anyone who says that the European Union didn't have a role to play, I think it's very disingenuous. I can understand people's frustrations with the focus of some of the funding and how that was shaped. Absolutely. But I think that's been recognised. I think there's more of an emphasis, for example, on the cross-border. I was always an Interreg woman. I was always about the cross-border cooperation being the medium in which you can achieve reconciliation and overcome difference. I was less convinced that peace and reconciliation agenda was focused on the right things. I'll just say that straight up.
And I think it would be remiss not to make reference to the 2004 Budapest Declaration that was very much around building civil society in Europe through community development. That's the title of the conference. Mm-hmm. March 2004, I've got it here, in Budapest in Hungary, as I say, to prepare for the accession of 10 new countries to the EU. And again, that sense that for all of the top-down kind of policy and structure and the diplomacy that goes into it, it needs to be met from the bottom up. There needs to be an environment at a scale that people recognise. And it comes back to this defining feature of place for so many people and their identity. Sometimes, sometimes not always positively, but is a defining feature. If it's met at a scale that people can recognise and can engage with, which is a lot around then maybe specific democratic kind of mechanisms and processes, then people usually, most people, and you testified to this, Caitriona, in terms of the vast majority of people who weren't being violent with one another, like I said, although I thought that was an interesting point you made around that's not necessarily not having prejudice, but at least not taking up any kind of violent armed struggle. The sense that most people do want better for themselves and others, and recognise that concept of community, and that they have something to both to benefit from that concept, but also they have a role to play in contributing to that and building that. And I wonder whether that 2004 Budapest Declaration, I'm presuming, were maybe a similar sort of era then in terms of what you were referring to, and the UK and Maastricht and things like that. And I'm minded as well that you talk about Interreg, a lot of work, and I would defer to your expertise, Giada, on this, a lot of work between Wales and Ireland, funded by some of that sort of work. For me, it's more than a coincidence that the parts of Wales that voted to remain in the European Union were those where they are the Welsh language heartlands, in the north and the west of Wales, where there's been a lot of work done by the EU to recognise the rights of minority language speakers, minority cultures and things like that. That seems to be more than a coincidence for me personally. And I'm just speaking from the bits that I know, and I'm sure there's more expertise on it than what I have, and there's also people who will know about their own particular areas as well in respect of things like minority rights and what have you. It is interesting, isn't it, that as much as we can be focused as community workers, and the people I was with, for example, in Swans, yes, they focused on just a particular estate or a particular, maybe a particular kind of an area defined by the postcode lottery of a project, or what the statistics of deprivation tell us, or whatever it might be, or the remit that a housing association has. However focused we are, kind of eyes down on that very, very local sense, actually, if we care to look up and maybe have our hand guided a little bit by people like yourselves who have the expertise, you can see that there are these connections up to a supranational level, if not global. When you look at some of the problems in, Ballymena has been in the news this week. You've got LA in the news. It was other parts of the UK not so long ago, where you have these flashpoints where people feel threatened, they feel oppressed, they feel aggrieved, however legitimate or otherwise we may as individuals think those grievances are. They get expressed in a way that perhaps isn't necessarily the most constructive way, but might be understandable. And I will defer again to other people who know, LA and Ballymena far better than I, and what's actually going on there. I don't want to, vicariously use these and rubberneck, what's going on in these communities to make a point. But I suspect I think I have a flavour of what's going on in some of those areas. That by bringing people together, by having the policy and the strategy, funding no doubt as well, services and facilitates the process of bringing people together to be heard, to speak. It's Martin Luther King that said the riot is the expression of the unheard. People are frustrated. They have these grievances. You need this wider policy context and the politicians doing their thing, so that us doing the community work and doing maybe some of the day-to-day unsexy stuff that doesn't have press conferences called about it and all the rest of it, and big conferences or whatever. That's where the hard yards are made and hopefully kind of retained as well, and they're kept. They're not lost. They're not rolled back.
Yeah. Going back to the Budapest thing, I think look, we at the moment I am working on stuff to do with European integration and European enlargement as well. I advise on a DG Regio initiative called the B Solutions Project, which specifically funds bottom-up approaches to addressing legal and administrative obstacles to cross-border integration, mobility, minority rights, multilingualism, all those kind of things in border regions. So it can literally support any obstacle that is legal or administrative in nature and needs a solution. And that requires organisations on the ground in border regions to actually apply for the resource. So it keeps that sort of integration bedded down at that local democratic level in border regions. And I think, we're seeing throughout Europe the importance of supporting minorities being included in border regional narratives and democratic governance. I think we need to look the whole way through across Europe, everywhere in, shall we say, complementary and I wouldn't say alternative forms of deliberative democracy, but look at forms of deliberative democracy that allow minorities and people who are less represented in electoral politics to continue to have a say and participate in policy and decision making. I think what we're seeing is the rise of a new fascism, which exploits people's social and economic insecurities and turns people against the people who are least able to defend themselves. And I think that's what you're seeing, certainly in Ballymena. You're seeing, I absolutely agree. These movements are formed on the backs of people suffering in communities which have not seen the same social and economic advantages as others. And that kind of exploitative approach means that you can end up with governance and government that's very, very distant from a lot of people. So the importance of that kind of stabilizing common shared methodologies in the community sector everywhere is huge. And as you're right, Russell, it's the unsexy stuff. It doesn't get reported. Nobody wants to know if you've actually successfully managed to prevent massive divisions and violence from breaking out. They just, people just report on, when things go wrong. So I think it does boil down to you can't keep society stable and you can't emancipate people without that action at grassroots level. And big political things don't happen without grassroots movements, be they good or bad.
One of the things, again, that struck me, I mean, you both mentioned books earlier, so I feel more comfortable in mentioning a book that I put out last year with Alan Twelvetrees, Community Development, Social Action, Social Planning, Practical Guide, 6th edition, it's on Policy Press. Alan and I did a podcast about it not so long ago. We had some content in there from Viola Kilmurray, titled Community Dialogue in Northern Ireland. And one of the things that came out very strongly in her contribution, it touched on the writing of Cynthia Coburn as well, was how important, how central women have been to some of this work at the grassroots as well. And I just wanted to maybe kind of surface that as well. I think there is a gender dimension to some of this, and my contribution to the wider chapter that Avila contributed to was around advanced community work practice and in areas of conflict. to a certain extent, Northern Ireland is an obvious destination to go to. But I posited a case study in that chapter around the miners' strike in the UK, in Wales, in South Wales, in the coalfield where I was working, and how even 20 years on, that was still a deeply, close to 40 years on, but at that time, even 20 years out from that, it still had deep, profound, obvious scars for some people, and divisions, not borders per se, but divisions still existed in the community. And that's another form of trauma. It's another form of conflict. It's another, has its corrosive impact. It's a labour dispute. It wasn't necessarily about, one's faith, one's religion. It didn't have a constitutional context to it. But women were important in that. And I came to learn that really acutely at that time. Is there a thread worth pulling out a little bit there, the role of women in some of this work?
Well, we have Caitriona here. She's representing the women that are doing amazing work in this field in Northern Ireland. I personally interviewed Davila several times, and in particular in relation to all the work that she has undertaken with former political prisoners in Northern Ireland, and in particular in their rehabilitation and reinsertion into society after they have been released as part of the Belfast Good Friday Agreement provisions. And I think that what has struck me the most is that, well, first of all, and I really believe that I've never met like such a strong women, so decisive and also like so skilled in communicating and in stand up for their own positions, but also for the work of the good of their society, with such a clear mindset and such a clear objectives, but also skillfully knowing how to steer the goals and framework of the communities within they were working towards a common objective. And I remember this quote from Avila where she was saying, where she was actually stating the importance of dialogue, because through dialoguing, even if it is dialoguing about matters that seems marginal, people do actually end up converging in their opinions and eventually to find common ground where common ground was not was seemed impossible to be found. And again, coming back to my previous point, just what really struck me of the approach that these civil society organizations that dealt with former political prisoners at the time was the fact that they did not simply thought about designing projects and plans that would tackle issues such as unemployment, mental health, and cross community relations in the areas in which they were active, but how they worked also to empower these groups and communities in take ownership of the peace process more largely, but in particular narrowing down to the issues that were connected with these societies and with these groups. So how then they allowed, for example, former political prisoners to become decision makers as well as project designers and project participants, which I thought is exactly a sort of embodiment of the bottom-up approach that we were talking about, and that Catriona explained it so well before. Nowadays, I have met and really I have been greatly impressed by other civil society organizations in different sites. Mostly it was localized in Belfast, but I'm sure that they exist all over Northern Ireland. For example, in and led particularly by women, leading work, serving in particular as communicators between civil society and dissident Republicans, dissident loyalists, which unfortunately still exist and are still active. And again, some of the strongest and the most skillful women I've ever met. I do even remember having asked them, "How do you feel as women doing this type of work?" And they were just saying to me, in Northern Ireland, we have such a strong tradition of women being active in our community. And it is something that I really, really admire. And then let's not forget that also in terms of the high politics, the women coalition, the Northern Ireland Women Coalition did amazing work and was absolutely key and functional to get to the achievement of signing the Belfast Good Friday Agreement in 1998. And this is part of the story that definitely doesn't need to be forgotten, even if, for example, from the point of view of an academic, the narrative tends to predilect men, and even the sources tend to be always focusing on a sort of main centric type of perspective. So one, especially when looking at the archives or when undertaking field work, needs to be very careful to actually go and look for the voices that were primarily active, but that in the narrative remains a little bit more marginalized. And I'm always very attentive to that. And I'm also super happy that I'm here with Catriona, because certainly she will be if she accepts one of my next interviews.
Sure. No problem. Happy to do that. I think, Russell, your point about women and stability. I mean, look, the UN have recognised the role of women in peace building for a very long time. Women, peace, and security is an equation. As Giada has said, I mean, we have particular strengths in Northern Ireland. I think possibly, if you're looking at, I suppose, the ethnographic or the anthropological roots of this idea of there being women who are prepared to take action in their communities, I think you have to look at industrialization. I think you have to look at the fact that, cities like Derry, for example, were huge production centres for garment making, shirt making. They say, the shirts for the British Empire were all made in Derry, but that meant that women were breadwinners in eras when there was not a lot of male employment. So women took on a particular role in that sense. And this is probably common to anywhere. I think there's something around port cities in general where there's a lot of commerce and trade historically, and then going back centuries now. Very often when you look in places like that, you see in census returns and other sort of ways of finding out who was living where, and street directories, you see that there are women living independently who are not necessarily married, but who have occupations like seamstress, like bookmaker, all of those kind of things. And there's something to do with, if there's a history of women's economic independence, it's maybe women find that memory of agency more easily than in societies where you don't have that history of economic independence of women, the economic autonomy of women. I'm always also very struck by, and this is on the island of Ireland, when you turn up as a woman with a northern accent and frank opinions south of the border, there's usually a bit of eye rolling. And it's like, oh God, these bolshy northern women again. Our history was slightly different. We had access to contraception. Women didn't have to give up their jobs in the public service when they got married. Women who were in the civil service had to give up their jobs when they got married, until well into the 1970s. So you have, these little sort of threads. That's not to say that, women in the Republic of Ireland aren't just as strident and active on all of these issues. They absolutely are. But I think there's a quality to that sense of maybe a kind of a sense of ancestral agency in Northern Ireland, which I think is something to do with industrialisation and the fact that Ulster was the part of the island of Ireland to be most industrialised during the Industrial Revolution. Anyway, that's just musing. I think what we have to look at also, if you're talking about stability and you're talking about, the role of women in societies and communities progressing towards social and economic emancipations, we have to talk about violence against gender-based violence and violence against women and girls. We have to talk about the fact that we have a wave of perhaps more overt misogyny being expressed now towards women and girls than maybe it was a little bit more hidden when people like me were younger. I think we need to talk about what the statistics there are. I think we should be looking at benchmarking reports like, for example, the fact that the UK and Ireland both signed up to the Istanbul Convention, which is a Council of Europe Convention on ending violence against women and girls and gender-based violence in general. And the Istanbul Convention evaluation reports of individual countries are very interesting to read, and they're very interesting to look at the baseline. For example, what are countries doing, what individual countries are doing to invest in domestic violence services and support services for anyone involved in coercive domestic abuse relationships. There is some really interesting research, and this is very relevant for societies emerging from conflict. There's some very interesting research that has been done by Professor Aisling Swain of University College Dublin in partnership with Foyle Women's Aid, which looks at identifying a very distinct quality to the coercive control experienced by partners of paramilitaries. And that research is well worth looking into. It was published in 2024, and it's called When You Know What They Are Capable of: Paramilitary Related Gendered Coercive Control. I absolutely take your point about the experience of the miners' strike, Russell. I mean, I remember all that. So you had the miners' strikes are something that I remember watching. I remember watching the riots. I remember in Northern Ireland we were very aware of that, and we were also very aware of the advocacy and the agency of women in that. Probably around the same time, the women were protesting at Greenham in terms of the anti-nuclear movement. So I think we do in the UK, we have a memory of women's agency and activism going back to a period of extreme turbulence. Also at a time when we were in a period of, I suppose, geopolitical tension with the Cold War, that maybe there are resonances of now as well. I don't know. I would absolutely agree that I think there needs to be more thought put into how women are supported. And I think there needs to be a lot more attention given to the role that misogyny plays in perpetuating structures and processes and generations of disempowerment of women. Because the thing is as well, I think with, there's some very good writing on this. As Kate Mann describes things like misogyny as being the shock collar of the patriarchy. So you only experience it when you step out of line. And I think we have to remember also that patriarchy harms men as well. So I think within all of this, if we're talking about peaceful societies and maintaining good relations in intercultural societies, and really just not letting that real toxic, divisive, racist manipulation of working class communities, I think we need to pay attention to all of these things on the ground at grassroots level and be really clear about what we're fighting against.
Well, I couldn't agree more, and I think that's a perfect kind of rallying cry, call to action as well, more broadly for a whole host of different things that no doubt we're involved in, both professionally and personally. Giada, is there anything else you'd like to say?
Just that I am absolutely agreeing with all the points that Catriona made, but I think I made it pretty clear all through the episodes that in relation to Brexit, the B word, what we really need to keep in mind, I believe, and this is something that I have been arguing probably for the past 3 years, is that Brexit has had, unfortunately, a polarizing effect, repolarizing then the two communities in Northern Ireland, but also the two parts of the island of Ireland. And that has been societal negative impact that has been somewhat overshadowed by all the very important, nonetheless, discussions related to trade, to socio-spatial frameworks, to the future of these islands and the UK Union post 2016. And for as much as it has been marginally discussed, the European Union has, as Catriona pointed out before, showcased an enduring commitment to investment in Northern Ireland, symbolized by the fact that the peace program, the EU peace program in emphasized by Peace Plus, has been the only EU program surviving the challenge of Brexit, and it is an instrument that has been designed to tackle polarization, not only within Northern Ireland but with a big cross-border dimension. And I think that civil servants, the public bureaucracy, and political representatives should actually take a much more attention to it, especially because it is something that has been designed to tackle polarization and therefore could be made to use to ensure the future of political stability on the island.
If people want to know a little bit more about your work, is there a way they can follow you, contact you, that kind of thing, Caitriona?
I'm on X. I'm one of those people who stayed on X, quite simply just to occasionally put out stuff that is sort of oppositional to some of the absolutely dreadful right wing stuff that you see flooding X. So I am on X as I'm Caitriona Mullan, and it's Caitriona. It's Caitriona Mullan, just all one word. I'm also can be followed on LinkedIn. That's how you can follow me. I occasionally get active, and occasionally I go through periods of not saying very much. With Giada, it's been a real pleasure for me to be able to cover these issues. I realise I've probably been quite fluid in how I've moved around some of the questions, and I thank Giada for her much more evidence-based approach to making some of her points. But I think for me, these kind of conversations are both professional, academic, and also to a degree personal, as a woman who's living in a place which is emerging from conflict, and also to have the privilege of being from Derry, which has this huge tradition of strength in community action. So it's a huge asset to know how that kind of action can change lives, and that idea of social movements being very important for change and for emancipation. It's also something I learned in the NHS when I was working there, and I did some fantastic training with Helen Bevan of NHS Horizons. So I think some of my attitude to some of this stuff has also been shaped by the fact that I worked in the NHS for 10 years, and that is really an incredible institution, despite all of the challenges that it has, as a design and as a concept and as a shared value-based institution. It's an absolutely fantastic organisation, and a very, very important one, I think, for social cohesion and stability in all of the services that it delivers to communities the whole way across the UK. Worth remembering.
Here to that, and thank you, and I'm very grateful as well and humbled by the extent to which you're bringing your personal experiences to this as well. I'm very, very, very grateful. Giada, if you want to know a little bit more about your work at Cardiff University, I can just come and knock on your door. Of course, I'll just find your office because it's only down the road. But for anyone else, what's the best way of following you?
I have a profile on LinkedIn. I left X and I'm not on Blue Sky, but everyone can find me on LinkedIn. My name on LinkedIn is Giadina 1988, which is the way the people calls me at home and in the family. Giadina means little Giada. And I regularly post there. I'm very active about all my work, and I'm also the president of the Irish Association for Contemporary European Studies. So I'm also very active on the IAS's website, where generally we post about all our activities, events we organize. And on the 17th of October, I will be hosting an event at Ulster University in conjunction with the Merchant Center at Ohio State and Professor Paul Carmichael on how to implement peace. So, Caitriona, if you ever can pin this down into your agenda, I would be delighted to have you as one of the speakers in one of our roundtables.
I would be more than happy, and I've worked with Paul on a couple of different events in the past. So yeah, you know how to get me. You have my email address. I'd be very happy
Yeah,
to. And
great.
just I suppose to say my future work, I actually do have quite a lot of professional work going on quite serious policy issues at the moment. Some of which I can talk about, and some of which is just very much sort of background, boring policy research. But if you follow me on LinkedIn, you can see stuff on the B Solutions program, which is this sort of repository of case studies on solving cross-border obstacles all over Europe on the internal and external borders, and hopefully pick up some useful other feeds on things when I'm sharing other people's interesting stuff too. So thank you very much.
Perfect. So this podcast is on Blue Sky. I just remembered it's a CD podcast, which was always the handle I wanted for Twitter, but someone had got there first. So now I've managed to get my my beach towel on that particular lounger on Blue Sky. Not particularly active on there at the moment, but we'll be cranking that up before too long. Giada, you didn't mention. Sorry, it's just occurred to me. I don't think you mentioned where exactly. You said you grow close to the border with France, but I want to give a little shout out to your town, village, your Milltis Square, as we say in Welsh.
The name of the village is Vernante, part of the province of Cuneo, and is known at the national level for Pinocchio
Oh,
because
right.
yeah, the person who actually wrote the story of Pinocchio was from Tuscany, but the first ever person who draw and give a face actually to Pinocchio was from my village. His name is Attilio Mussino. So if anyone wants to visit a border village, you can also find all over the village, on the walls of all the houses, murals of representing the story of Pinocchio in all its entirety, all across the village. So,
Fantastic.
Spell that for me, please.
Vernante, Vernante, 800 souls.
Lovely part of the world, I'm sure.
Is there a cross-border region that's part of, like a Euregio or anything, Giada?
Yes, so we are part of the Alpi Marittime
Oh
and
yeah.
the Occitania, and we
Oh
have
yeah.
Interreg Cotra.
Ah, okay. Yeah. Okay.
Well,
Fantastic.
Yeah, so thank you once again to you both. There's probably a ton of links I could probably put in the show notes as well. Best luck with doing what you're doing. Derry is even more so on my bucket list of places to visit, and hopefully it won't be before too long. So thank you very much once again.
Thank you.
You're more than welcome.
Thank you for listening to the Community Development Podcast. And to support the podcast and help it share learning, connect the workforce, and raise the profile and the merits of community development approaches, why not become a Patreon at patreon.com/the CD podcast.